Well, this is Dr. Stan back here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay, and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story, hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at, that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's going to be reality, not illusion or delusion, that will determine what the future will bring. And I need to remind you the views expressed here are not necessarily those of the owners, management, staff, sponsors, or supporters of the station you're listening to. They happen to be my views, and, well, for the next hour, they're going to be views of Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief. Hi, Joel. How are we doing?
I'm just fine, Dr. Stan.
Well, what are we going to be talking about today, besides, of course, the Greek Parliament vote? Are we going to talk about that?
Yes, we are. That's the top story for tomorrow's World Affairs Brief, how Greek default is, in my opinion, inevitable.
All right, fine. Well, you know, the most interesting thing is I've been up on the Internet trying to find out exactly what the Greek government voted on, and every time I go up there and I pull out an article and it tells, stipulates what they voted on, it crashes my computer. Now, I'm sure you probably have. In fact, I got one of the articles off your website, and after crashing my computer twice, I figured I'd wait and hear what you had to say. But basically, of course, I'm going to let Joel tell you, because, of course, the Greek Parliament voted for very, very almost draconian measures in an effort to try to bring things under control. It's not going to solve the problem. Go right ahead, Joel.
Yeah, we'll get to that in the report. But frankly, Greek bankruptcy is looming, and the European Central Bank is playing a desperate game by prolonging the inevitable with temporary financing packages that will not be enough, frankly, not even close. The numbers just don't add up. Greece simply does not have the economic power to both pay its debts and keep its socialist benefit, salary, and pension packages fully funded, even with austerity cuts. Even worse, with financial confidence in the Greek economy at its lowest level ever, the tiny nation's ability to generate foreign exchange to pay its current debt is decreasing and not even stable, all the while agreeing to new bailouts that increase the total indebtedness. And this is just a solution that won't work. This could be the next big financial storm that Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner alluded to in a private meeting to Wall Street insiders this last month. In May, among a group of Wall Street people in New York watching the screening of the HBO film Too Big to Fail, Tim Geithner dropped the bombshell, according to my brother Mark's financial newsletter, Forecasts and Strategies. Mark found out he privately told his Wall Street friends that he was certain another financial collapse is on the way and that raising taxes on the wealthy is inevitable. He says, it will come again, there will be another storm. Well, that could very well be what this Greek situation, if it defaults, and I think there's nothing but a default, it's just a matter of time, will determine. Yesterday, German banks, who made most of the bad loans to Greece, agreed to a $3 billion debt rollover. That means that they were going to pledge to redo the debts instead of requiring the Greece pay them off, that they would roll them over into 30-year Greek bonds, and nobody in their right mind is investing in 30-year Greek bonds. They just know that it's not going to happen. But that's where the pressure is from the financial powers that be to all of the banks, is to roll those debts over.
Well, it's going to be very interesting to see how it all plays out, but certainly it looks to me like they're going to raise the retirement age from 50 to 65. I thought it was going to be 70, but apparently it's from 50 to 65. How do you think the people feel? They've been promised, you're going to retire at 50, and now at 65. They're going to raise, of course, the value-added tax from 13%, this is a federal sales tax, to 25%. And all the other cuts and increased taxes are going to use, and it's still not going to solve the problem. Socialism doesn't work, ladies and gentlemen, so why are we adopting it here in the United States? We'll be right back. Well, this is Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty. Our guest this afternoon, Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief. And Joel is simply saying that certainly what's happening in Greece is simply a temporary measure. Greece is eventually going to default, and this will have serious implications, not only as far as the European banks are concerned, but do you think this is going to influence the American banking system as well, Joel?
Yes, it will in a couple of ways. First of all, there's a lot of money market funds that, in fact, have been induced to invest in these European banks, and thus they're at risk of losing their shirt if these banks have to write down a lot of these losses. The records of who's investing in what from the Federal Reserve are locked up, and the Federal Reserve isn't talking, and so it's kind of difficult to find out, what people's exposures are. But what we know now from the Fed is that they're deeply involved in these processes and are using their liquidity, power to print money, basically, to keep a lot of these German banks funded. But it's going to be an increasing problem, as I'll explain. British-based financial analyst Nadim Walayat, writing for the Market Oracle, had some interesting analysis of what happened. This guy is Arabic, and it's incredible to try to read his stuff. The run-on sentences go on for a whole paragraph without commas, and so I've straightened it out in my World Affairs Brief and tried to put it into better grammar, but here goes. He says the Greek population is in constant revolt with another 48-hour national strike underway against ever-expanding announcements of economic austerity. Though to date, he said, little of which has actually been implemented. And that was true until Wednesday, when, of course, Greece's Prime Minister George Pompidou managed to push through the deeply unpopular cuts and austerity things on Wednesday, as you mentioned, the VAT tax more than doubling. And believe me, that is a crushing blow to an economy. I mean, restaurants really suffer, for example, when people have to pay 25% more for the meal. When France had a high VAT tax like that, almost a third of the restaurants went out of business within a year until they lowered it.
This is the value-added tax that they put. It's like a federal sales tax going up from 13 to 25%. Go right ahead.
Yeah, it's very bad. The austerity packages include mild spending cuts, but huge tax increases, as we said. Therefore, taxpayers, he says, of core Europe and to a lesser degree Britain are being taxed. He's wrong about that. They're not being taxed directly.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back here with Joel. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Joel is explaining to us, of course, what's going to be happening in Greece. Suddenly they've doubled the value-added tax. This is like a federal sales tax from 13 to 25%. And, of course, he points out that certainly in France, where they did this some years ago, almost a third of the restaurants went out because you were paying an additional 25% for the cost of eating out. And, of course, anything you buy, you're paying an additional 25%. But go ahead, Joel. I'm sure you want to cover all the things that they're going to do to try to raise income and certainly cut benefits, but they don't dare cut the benefits. Already, certainly raising the age of retirement from 50 to 65 is certainly a tremendous blow to the Greeks who expect that they're entitled to retire at 50 with comfortable benefits. And when you take things away from people, they get angry, and that's, of course, why the massive demonstrations in Athens yesterday, which you did not see on, certainly displayed at least a great deal on public radio. We talked about all sorts of other unimportant issues, who won the voice contest, and really important issues like that. About the civil unrest in Greece really was hardly worthwhile mentioning. Go right ahead.
Well, certainly no one is sympathetic to Greece's 50-year-old retirement package. I mean, this is just obscene, and nobody needs to be retiring at 50, and so this is a major demand of the European countries who work hard. They aren't going to be bailing out Greece unless they change that, and I'm glad that they did. What my author points out here that I'm quoting from is that from the Market Oracle, is that most of these demonstrators are put out on the streets by communists. They're looking for an excuse to take down the government, and it could easily fall. The rest of the mainstream people in Greece know that they're in trouble and know that their only solution is not a revolution with the communists, not more socialist promises, but in fact to cut down their benefit packages to survive within the euro, because so much of the business with Greece, I mean, you cut yourself off from the European community, you've lost access to all of those markets, and it's just a very big problem for them already because of the increased VAT tax. Tourism is down to Greece because of the social unrest. People don't want to do business with Greece. I mean, it's just, there's no way that the economy is going to survive this. Core Eurozone countries are effectively, though, being blackmailed by the threat of Greek default and, having to finance Greece's public budget deficit and the interest payments due on the ever-expanding debt. Yes, the debts are not being reduced, contrary to what you may think, but increased with each new bailout. All that the European Union has done is to throw good money after bad by wasting 100 billion euros and pushing Greek debt up from 260 billion euros to, get this, 330 billion euros now. Do you think that's going to solve their problem?
What do you mean you can't get out of debt by borrowing more money?
Well, the U.S. thinks that they can do that, but that's because they have unlimited printing abilities, but the Greeks don't.
Okay, go right ahead.
He suggests a solution to the crisis means the European monetary union is splitting into two currency blocks, he says later, one for the weak that suffer high inflation and interest rates, and the more competitive countries as part of the Euro bloc 2 could be Germany on its own with France. I don't think they'll ever accept that. He doesn't understand the globalist agenda here, that whatever they do, they don't want the European Union to crash over this. In fact, they'll use the crisis, in my opinion, to talk countries into giving the banks more central powers rather than less. Right now, the British are very much in favor of the fact that they're not part of the euro. They're sitting back and watching this. Trouble is, most of their banks are deeply involved in the crisis because the leaders of the British Empire, of course, are very deep into the globalist conspiracy to bring their nation in. Some argue that a sharp, sharp shock, Iceland-style default would prove better in the long run, which is true. But he says there would be blood in the streets, perhaps even revolution, and I think it's going to happen anyway. That would be infinitely worse for the Greek population than what is taking place today. Well, that's easy to say because what's taking place today is a postponement of the inevitable, and that's hardly a statement that they can keep this up forever. Therefore, the Greek lifestyle is being subsidized by hardworking taxpayers elsewhere, and those demonstrating in the streets of Greece, he says, are mostly delusional, or they represent subversive interests such as the Communist Party that are banking on profiting from the debt crisis chaos, whereas Greeks actually got what they're asking for, that is an exit from the euro and the debt default, then the Greek population would soon, perhaps within 24 hours, come to regret the outcome, as all roads would instantly lead to bankruptcy with all of its consequences. Now, what he's talking about is not that the Greek government wants out of the euro, but the Greek people do, and the reason is the socialists realize the thing that is prohibiting us from creating our own money supply and inflating to be able to meet all our demands and being like the United States is the fact that we're tied to the euro. Europeans, any one part of the EU monetary union is required to stay within a 3.5 inflationary window during the year. And the Greeks want more. The only way you can have more is to go back to the drachma. And then they'd inflate it out of, existence, just like any other socialist country. But it would put them in a cushy area for another 10 years, and that's what they want. If Greece were ejected from the Eurozone, then there would soon be an exodus of Greece's best and brightest workers as they sought earnings in hard currency, such as the euro, rather than being paid in worthless drachmas, something that the Eurozone politicians may be considering behind closed doors. Now, they would be able to do that, and unfortunately it's a problem because even though you're not part of the European Monetary Union, if you're part of the EU, then Greek workers can essentially leave their country and just flood into Europe, and you'd have more, people on the streets looking for work in Europe. Greece landed its debt-filled Trojan horse economy onto the shores of the Eurozone in 1999, following which, as if by magic, a high interest rate, high risk economy, talking about how they got into the euro, became a low interest rate, low risk economy just by joining the European Union. How did Greece achieve this apparent miracle? By perpetuating state-sponsored fraud as the country proceeded to hide the true extent of public spending, debt, and liabilities from the market and European Central Bank. As there was no longer a currency market that would reflect the real state of the economy. What he's saying is that when the drachma was exchanged for the euro, nobody had any way to see the hidden maneuvers that were going on, the cooking of the books, so to speak, that were going on in Greece. They were supposedly sticking, and there were regulations to make sure that each country doesn't print more than 3.5% more euros each year than the year before. But they didn't realize that behind the scenes they were borrowing money from German banks. Now, German banks should have been, and that's why I can't believe that the European Central Bank didn't know that this was going on. German banks should have been, telling on the Greeks, but they didn't. Of course, the Greek population can argue that most of the blame lies with their bankers, which is true, because the bailout is for holders of Greek debt, which is mostly held by European banks, and mostly German at that. But the same holds true for every other country that has seen its politicians dump all of the banking sector losses and liabilities onto the backs of the taxpayers. Now, that happens only belatedly through inflation, the ultimate bailout vehicle. Taxpayers are being spared the direct burden of bailouts and default. That has put every Western country on the path toward bankruptcy without any resistance from the voters. And that's why I'm against all this borrowing and deficit spending, because we really need to have, if voters want to go to war in Libya, then let them pay and let them get that yearly bill and realize, wow, this is too expensive, I want out.
Well, because the thing is, I think the American people have to understand, 40 cents of every dollar the federal government is spending today is borrowed money. How long can you continue doing that? If we had had to pay for the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, why the American people would have been up in arms. But instead of that, we just borrowed the money to fight it, just like we borrowed the money to fight the Vietnam War and the first Gulf War. But now, of course, we have massive debt that can never be paid off. And eventually, of course, there's only a couple of things you can do. You can default on your debt. Well, they're not going to do that, I don't think. But you simply hyperinflate it away, destroy the value of everybody's savings and everybody's annuities and everybody's CDs, everybody's insurance policies, everybody's pensions. And then, of course, there's something you got to realize, how they've been simply robbed by the elite that control both political parties. Go right ahead.
Well, they can't really hyperinflate it away, besides the fact that I've talked about many times before of the high volume of dollars internationally. You can actually get away with a lot of inflation, a lot of printing of money and creating the money without causing hyperinflation. But the reason they can't do it here is the government does not set wage and price policies as they do in Europe. In other words, there's no way for people to raise their wages to keep pace with a rising rate of inflation that's above 10 to 15%. And because of that, it would cause immediate stagflation and horrible effects on the economy. That would make people so angry they'd throw the rascals out. That's the reason they don't have that option here and there. They've got to play the game of inflating without causing a great deal of price inflation, or at least what they can't hide behind the alterations and the manipulations of the CPI, which is distorted downward. But the taxpayers of Germany and France are effectively trapped into a lose-lose situation where the only solution is for either collapse of the European currency, which is not going to happen, or for a total political, economic, and monetary union, meaning more power that the Greek collapse may justify, giving permanent financing to states like Greece as a means of internal transfers. Just like in London Southeast subsidized most of the rest of the country because that's where most of the income is made.
Well, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. Of course, we've not only Greece, we've got Portugal, we've got Spain, we've got Italy, we've got Belgium. All of these countries are certainly not too far behind Greece as far as its financial insolvency. We're on the edge of some very, very serious implications financially. They're going to have tremendous implications here. and few Americans understand what's really going on. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, that's a perfect introduction to the next paragraph in our World Affairs Brief. Joining Greece are the other European bankrupting nations to varying degrees that are collectively referred to as the PIGS, how appropriate, P-I-I-G-S, which is Portugal, Italy, Iceland, Greece, and Spain, though a few others such as Belgium, which you also mentioned, should be included. Britain and other European nations outside the Eurozone, while having the ability to print money and inflate their debt away at a steady pace, are still at risk of bankruptcy and actual debt default if they could no longer service their external debts, which are denominated in foreign currencies, hence the contagion. Financing, albeit shrinking annual PIGS deficits over the next few years, will mean that all of these countries' debt burdens will be higher in 3 years' time. Greece's debt burden is expected to rise from 120% of GDP to as high as 150%, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's already there because of the increased debt they've taken on and the shrinking economy. How is that a solution for the debt crisis? How do you avoid default when you can't pay the existing debt by taking on more debt? The answer is it won't. The only solution for the Eurozone economies is to get their economic houses in order to cut the deficits and total debt as a percentage of GDP, which can only be achieved through economic growth and public sector spending cuts. Now, benefit cuts and excessive union salaries are never cut in a democratic nation unless a nation or company is faced with bankruptcy, which is one of the reasons why default is beneficial in this case in the long run, because it would cause them to wake up to the consequences of spending so much money on socialist programs. Well, this series of money-printing debt monetization bailouts puts the euro firmly on a trend towards high inflation, as are all fiat currencies. The fundamentals of the euro bloc, composed of many small, weak economies, cannot devalue internally. Each nation, as I said, is limited to 3.5% inflation, so they can't devalue their debt by inflating at 10 to 12%. Hence the need to borrow on the sly. The mainstream press predominantly focuses on the bottom line numbers of by how much are each country's banks exposed to Greek government debt without fully understanding that total exposure is about 100 times greater. This is an important point as a function of the derivatives market that gambling-prone British banks are more exposed to in terms of per capita than virtually any other nation on this planet. This is the 900-pound gorilla lurking which threatens to trigger a huge collapse or bailout, as in the U.S. with AIG. Forget the official UK statistics of $1 trillion for public sector debt. Total actual debt and liabilities are in excess of $11 trillion in Britain, and the fools in coalition government are now contemplating Britain borrowing money in the name of UK taxpayers to throw to the Greek black hole. I mean, it's just like the U.S. paying billions in foreign aid. With what? We don't have the money. But they'll keep doing it until default arrives, or, as I have predicted, that a war arrives to give them an excuse to walk away from the debt and say we have to start all over. Wars justify everything, as you know, Stan.
I know, and I fear that the war is coming. Everything, nothing going on over the Middle East and the Near East makes sense today unless you understand that we are preparing to go to war there. And nobody is really talking about that except you and a few other people out there trying to sound the alarm. And, of course, instead we're arguing over all sorts of unimportant issues, but about Obama's birth certificate. Why don't we talk about the really important thing, the coming war? We'll be back in just a moment here. Well, this is Dr. Stan, our guest Joel Skousen. Joel, go right ahead.
Well, in reference to Obama's birth certificate, there are truly unimportant things relative to sports and social networking and other things on the news. But Obama's birth certificate, as you know, I'm sure, is important for the thing that it's one of the proofs of conspiracy. It's one of the proofs that you have a massive linkage between government and the media covering up for this imposter of a president, not eligible for the presidency. And so I don't think that they're really, trying to divert us. In fact, they'd rather we never discuss this. That's why they brought out the forgery, to try to put this thing to rest. It only exacerbated things in the sense that it was such an obvious forgery. But, even war we can't do much about because of the rising new neocons within the Republican Party. Even Tim Pawlenty is showing, neocon roots. Sarah Palin has talked about attacking Iran, and Mitt Romney, and, of course, John Huntsman is a closet globalist. Rick Perry's a closet globalist. There's just no hope in terms of stopping this warmongering agenda as long as they aren't taxing us for it and people won't protest. But one of the things that we can do, of course, is use the evidence of conspiracy and cover-up to awaken more people to the fact that this isn't going to be solved by electing more Republicans to office unless it's a Ron Paul. And, of course, I don't know how long he would live with the kind of conspiracy that we're dealing with in government. But inflation is the only solution to the debt crisis left. It's not a solution. It merely postpones the inevitable. The only solution to the unfolding debt crisis was for government to print money and inflate their way out of debt. What we've seen over the past 2 years is just the first phase of inflation. Phase 2 is consumer prices rising, and phase 3 is the inflation of wages. Now, this author is speaking from the British standpoint. That can only happen in nations where governments dictate wages, as in the UK. The U.S. has no mechanism to do this, which is why stagflation rather than hyperinflation is more probable here in this country. And it acts as a restraint on the politicians because it would be extremely unpopular to have massive inflation without the ability of people to deal with it. While many may argue that many aspects of UK public debt are linked to inflation, such as benefits and state wages have an inflation rider with them. But unfortunately, the real inflation is a good, he says, 2 to 3% higher than the official inflation indexes. And so most of the inflation indexing, in fact, is eaten up by real inflation. It's not keeping pace. Better than nothing, but it doesn't keep pace. Now, what does this mean for Greece? Greece cannot inflate unless they go back to the national currency, the drachma. So they have no choice but to leave the euro to enable them to inflate everything. In other words, you have to get out of the European monetary union. That's different from the European Union. And go back to your drachma. Then you can inflate everything, prices and wages. The only reason why they're being prevented from defaulting and leaving the eurozone is because banks of the other European countries are not strong enough to withstand such an event. And thus they're throwing good money after bad in order to postpone the inevitable. So it's almost like, the banks are begging Greece to stay and not default, hoping that they'll be able to pass through this bullet. And I don't think it's going to be able to met. There is no firewall between Britain and Europe. If Eurozone banks start to go bankrupt, so then will most of British banks. And there's a lot of U.S. exposure as well, although the U.S. has as its ultimate backstop the Fed's ability to print money and the trillions and hundreds of trillions of dollars that are outstanding, which allow them to do that without it showing up as hyperinflation. Well, the time horizon for the manifestation of the inevitable debt defaults can only be guessed at, as it depends on how much taxpayers' money will be thrown at the bankrupting states, painlessly at first only because it's money created on computers. It only gets painful when the prices start to rise. And before sovereign debt default starts to spread to other countries. Readers should be under no illusion that the bankruptcy of whole countries is inevitable. Now, I say in response that only smaller countries, and then only if the big boys cut off funding, which they can draw out actually for a lot longer than this author that I'm quoting from thinks. And one of the things the writer is counting on is the power of China to intervene and boost, or is not counting on, is the power of China to intervene and boost the euro artificially by converting dollars to euros. And that's exactly what's happening right now, Stan, according to the Wall Street Journal.
All right, fine. Well, I think we're living in very, very dangerous times. I don't think most people really understand how all of our banks are interconnected, how they really, of course, we have a totally fiat money supply. There's nothing behind money throughout the world. And this is what our founding fathers feared. This is why they wanted our currency to be backed by gold and silver. But, of course, we've announced that temporarily, only temporarily, mind you. I'm back on August 15th, the year 1971. But of course, that temporary emergency still exists today, and it's not going to be solved until the whole house of cards comes tumbling down. We'll be right back. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and you go right ahead, Joel.
So we're talking about China's intervention in Europe. For months, there were whispers of an Asian buying spree that had permeated the markets when the euro fell below certain levels. That talk has kept the euro-dollar values hemmed into a tight 7% range since late May, even as fears of a Greek default make traders disinclined to hold the euro. China, the world's biggest holder of foreign exchange reserves, has pledged financial support to the distressed eurozone without touting its economic links to Europe. What's going on is behind the scenes, China's dishing out billions in loans to EU nations, but there's a string attached. China's demanded assurances from various EU nations that China's abysmal human rights record be suppressed in the media. As the CS Monitor wrote, Chinese Premier Wen caused a shock in London on Monday by sharply admonishing the Tory government of Prime Minister David Cameron for raising dissident cases in the media, saying that 5,000 years of history has taught the Chinese never to talk to others in a lecturing way. In Berlin, he repeated his government's desire not to be upbraided by moral or legal presentation. Well, ahead of the trip, of course, to set a good tone of conciliation, China released artist Ai Weiwei and the activist Hu Jiao, two dissidents widely admired in Europe. Yet Cameron raised 4 prominent cases of dissidents detained under extrajudicial circumstances. Ai Weiwei and Hu Jiao were among those noted. In Berlin, Wen said that Chinese leaders expect from the EU respect for our sovereignty, our territorial integrity, and the autonomous choices of the Chinese people, as if holding these dissidents prisoner was a choice of the Chinese people. Well, Carrie Brown, head of the Chatham House at the CFR globalist affiliate Asia program in London, rationalized that Chinese leaders viewed dissidents as criminals, pure and simple, and that both Wen and Cameron have constituencies they must please. The hardliners are in control in Beijing right now, so we must expect them to do their thing. I mean, can you imagine these evil people trying to justify this kind of tyranny?
Well, I think most people in England don't even know what Chatham House is. I do a program there every week, and for 30, 45 minutes, I keep going back and I say, you think that you're being run by Parliament? You're being run by the people at Chatham House at number 10 St. James Square there in London. And, well, apparently some of the people over there learning what's going on. Well, this is Dr. Stan. Our guest is Joel Skousen. Joel has certainly been going into the background of what's going on, how the Chinese are actually funding many of the governments over there, buying up a government debt in Europe. Why would they be doing that? Well, they're demanding, of course, that the European governments stop talking about the suppression of human rights in China. They're letting the Europeans know in no uncertain terms they don't welcome their criticism of China's, of course, oppressive policy of jailing or certainly doing other things to dissidents. Well, and of course, Europe is totally dependent, and America is increasingly dependent on the authoritarian regime in communist China, which the American government helped to install back in 1949, because we can't let the common people know we brought this ruthless tyranny to China, just exactly as we helped bring the ruthless tyranny to Germany back in the 1930s. It's like deja vu all over again. Our our guest is Joel Skousen. And Joel, would you like to tell our listeners how they could subscribe to the World Affairs Brief if they'd like to?
Thank you. The World Affairs Brief is my weekly news analysis service. It's only $24 for the rest of the year, and people can learn about it at my website, worldaffairsbrief.com. They can get a free sample issue by emailing me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com.
And then, of course, Joel has 3 books, which we do carry. It's all about certainly a strategic relocation, of having a secure home, having a room in your home. Let me point out that I just read this last week, that Switzerland is going to add an additional 5,000 fallout shelters in Switzerland. Why are they doing that? Well, because Sweden is building fallout shelters, certainly South Korea is building fallout shelters, and they may know something that you and I don't know. Go right ahead.
Well, even more importantly, Russia is doubling the number of their fallout shelters in Moscow because there aren't sufficient. I mean, it's very clear the Russians are preparing to launch a nuclear war and to survive the consequences, whereas our government doesn't say a thing about those things. And that's why I've always felt that people must be prepared for a takedown, prepared for war so they can live to fight another day. I mean, we're dealing with an evil conspiracy in government which isn't adverse to causing terrorist attacks on our nation or creating whole wars in order to justify a globalist resistance and stampede people into accepting a globalist government, which is, I think, why they're leading us towards war and why they're covering up for Russian rearmament and Chinese rearmament. That's one of the things that I cover in the brief here, is that Russia's continuing their missile buildup. The U.S. continues to do nothing about the increased militarization in China and Russia. The AP just reported that Russia's Navy successfully test-fired an advanced ballistic missile from a new generation nuclear submarine, following a string of failed tests that dimmed the deployment of Moscow's most expensive post-military project. The Bulava missile's warhead went 5,500 kilometers downrange. The Bulava is a three-stage hypersonic intercontinental ballistic missile with highly maneuverable warheads capable of dodging any potential missile defenses. It's designed to have a range of 8,000 kilometers and carries 6 to 10 individually targeted nuclear warheads. Now, that makes this the most dangerous missile in the world, and the U.S. says nothing about it. Of course, we can only assume that the same technology is going on the latest versions of the Topol land-based mobile interceptor. Yet the U.S. continues to be silent about this threat that dwarfs what Iran can present. All we hear about is Iran and its continued testing of medium-range missiles and a nascent nuclear program. Yet we have an actual real threat going on, and all we can do is do disarmament with Russia while they continue to build more missiles. And if they're building more missiles, they're, of course, putting new nuclear weapons on those missiles.
And I would simply point out that as far as the elite in America are concerned, they already have extensive underground facilities for them, safe facilities for the elite, for the people in Washington, D.C., but even for a lot of the elitists here on the West Coast, they have their centers where they will go in case of when the nuclear war comes. But they have specifically disbanded all of our civilian defense facilities, everything. We used to have something 400 surgical hospitals, where people could get medical care. Certainly, if there was a problem, the hospitals were down. They've just done away with all of them. We have absolutely nothing ready. We saw how well prepared they were when Katrina came along, and the only thing they had was a Superdome there, and that wasn't not enough food or water there even for a few days. So we have to ask ourselves, why are they preparing to protect the elite and our elected representatives, but not the American people? And that's why Joel's books on the secure home, strategic relocation, and certainly building a safe room are so vitally important. Those books are available by calling 1-800-544-8927. 1-800-544-8927. And some people may agree with me because I will tell you, Joel, we sell an awful lot of your books, but go right ahead.
Well, that's good. I'm hopeful that people are getting prepared. It's a real shame if we, who are most sensitive to the issues of liberty and to the conspiracies going around us, blindly go forward fighting without preparing for the onslaught that's coming, and that's what my books are designed to do. Meanwhile, our own missile defense system is really a sham, not intended to protect us from the coming strike. Washington Times military expert Bill Gertz had this report, said a forthcoming study by the Pentagon's Defense Science Board concludes that an Obama administration plan to shoot down long-range Iranian missiles shortly after launch will not work, let alone the maneuvering warheads Russia is installing. Senator Richard Shelby, Alabama Republican, said, the report's unclassified conclusion is that the Missile Defense Agency plans to achieve an early intercept called a boost phase intercept as part of the phased adaptive approach, they're simply not credible. The interceptor would be used against Iran's arsenal of medium-range, intermediate-range missiles. In the future, the Pentagon said it has plans to use Block 2B weapons for so-called early intercept before a missile releases its warhead or decoys. The only trouble is the missile can't reach the intercept fast enough from Europe to intercept missiles in their boost phase. And U.S. interceptors have no warhead. They have to make perfect contact to bring down another warhead. So this is very interesting, and that's why the Russians, of course, know that the U.S. basing the missiles in Poland is intended for them, not Iran.
And I think it's so significant to realize, of course, that the Russian missiles all have small nuclear devices on them, so they will explode, and, of course, they'll take down anything in the area where it explodes. The Americans certainly don't want an effective missile system. We have to hit a bullet with a bullet. The Russians know that's not practical, and so basically they have explosive warheads, and we have, well, we'll hit a bullet with a bullet because we're so much smarter than they are. They have an extensive anti-ballistic missile system, and we have 6 anti-ballistic missiles stationed up in Alaska to deal with the thousands of nuclear weapons that are aimed at America. What's wrong with this picture? Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, of course, the U.S. is transitioning the Aegis missile defense system to act as a land-based missile system. Still, we're not dealing with an explosive warhead, so it's really a moot point. Well, there's more confirmation on the Russian deception from a dissenter's son. I have long promoted, of course, the evidence that the so-called fall of the Soviet Union was a carefully crafted deception. Recently, the son of a Russian dissident from the Soviet era became a subscriber of mine and sent me this note. He said, I have to say your analysis of post-Soviet Russia is dead accurate. My father, who was a prominent dissident and an uncompromising fighter against the barbaric socialist regime in the Soviet Union, after spending 18 years in gulags and KGB prisons, he committed suicide in 1987 in Armenia. Just prior to his death, he told me that all real dissidents were dead and their movement was totally infiltrated. I believe that's what killed him, he said. As soon as Gorbachev came to power and started talking glasnost and perestroika, there was a dissidents meeting in our house. My father and his friends came to the conclusion that Gorbachev was working for Wall Street, and he'll help the KGB to take over the country under a new name. I was a teenager then. He said, I've witnessed all that talk personally. How accurate were they? It's incredible that you see it all through your analysis from here in the United States. He congratulates me on that. Well, his father's comment about real and false dissidents is very, very important. The ones that were allowed to escape to the West, mostly leftist or Marxist Jews, went along with the phony fall of communism and never expressed any doubts about this massive contradiction in history. Now, I don't blame his father for thinking Gorbachev was working for Wall Street. Many U.S. conservatives think that, too, due to the disinformation spread by Rowan Gaither, the head of the Ford Foundation. He said, we operate here under directives which emanate from the White House. The substance of these directives under which we operate is that we shall use our grant-making power to alter life in the United States such that we can comfortably merge with the Soviet Union. In fact, this was a half-truth to throw congressional investigator Norman Dodd off the track. Gaither gave them a semi-plausible reason to explain why U.S. foundations were covertly helping out the Soviet Union. The globalist bankers in America were doing all they could to secretly fund communism and, of course, Russia every concession and entree into American institutions. But the purpose was not to comfortably merge the two antagonists, but rather to facilitate Russian espionage and military buildup so as to accelerate the time when Russia would attack the U.S., which the globalists intended to use as the ultimate new Pearl Harbor to justify shoving the U.S. into a new world order in order to save itself after the attack. During the, quote, fall, Americans were not calling the shots, as his father thought, but they did actively downplay and cover up for all the contradictions that showed that the Gorbachev coup was faked. And so was the miraculous rise of Boris Yeltsin before a seemingly hapless Communist Party still in control of the levers of power. And, it just was so obvious, even as a young person watching this, and I was just amazed the media were just spouting what was happening and not criticizing what was being told. Of course, now I understand.
Reality is usually scoffed at. Illusion is usually king. Go right ahead.
How well put. The real victims of this grand deception were the naive Americans who bought the lie, hook, line, and sinker, and they still do. Conservatives want to believe that we won and that Ronald Reagan did it, but it wasn't true. Already Russia is rearming and the West is still asleep due to our leaders' assurance that there is no threat. Well, in another interesting piece of news, it's very interesting that North Korea is now to head the UN Disarmament Commission. It's, as the Daily Caller put it, it's the latest "you've got to be kidding" news out of the United Nations. North Korea assumes the presidency of the UN's Conference on Disarmament Tuesday. Bare months after the UN finally suspended Colonel Muammar Gaddafi from its Human Rights Council, North Korea wins the propaganda coup of heading the World Disarmament Agency. It's like asking the fox to guard the chickens.
Well, I feel so much better that the North Koreans are in charge rather than Gaddafi. Go ahead.
Well, U.S. permissiveness with this, the most dangerous small-time tyranny in the world, is purposeful, in my opinion. North Korea shows off its new mobile missile this week, making North Korea's nuclear arsenal increasingly hard to get to target in a future war. The New York Post reported Defense Secretary Robert Gates, who was just given the Medal of Freedom by Congress, dropped a bit of a bombshell about North Korea's nuclear know-how. He said North Korea now constitutes a direct threat to the United States, as if they didn't before. He said they are developing road mobile ICBMs. It's a huge problem. Finding mobile missiles is tough enough. But we must remember that North Korea has repeatedly reneged on pledges to dismantle its nuclear program and continues to build nuclear missiles, all without meaningful sanctions from the U.S. or the UN. The only thing North Korea has received in response to its recalcitrance is assurances against regime change and promises of no military intervention. Compare this to our response to Libya and Iran. It's clear that North Korea is being preserved as a trigger event for World War III, so watch for saber rattling in this area.
Agreed. I think it's only a matter of time before the next major war comes along, and nobody's even considering that as a possibility. And yet there's no way out of the financial mess we're in today without that. And of course, everybody should see that certainly we're overthrowing all of those governments over there in the Middle East in preparation for a major conflict, and how it's going to play out, I don't know. But I think that Plato had said, only the dead have seen the end of war. Go right ahead.
Well, the last story in today's brief is Congress fails to rein in Obama on Libya. President Obama's most arrogant defense yet of unlimited executive power, he told the nation this week that he doesn't have to consult Congress on Libya because Libya is not at war. Or we are not at war with Libya. I don't even have to get to the constitutional question, he says, because the War Powers Act does not apply. Well, incredibly, GOP presidential candidate Tom Pawlenty agreed. Tim Pawlenty said Tuesday that the War Powers Act does not apply to the U.S. intervention in Libya, but that he would have consulted Congress as a courtesy. Incredible. Congressman Ron Paul vehemently disagrees and said the Constitution is clear. Only Congress can authorize war, and this is war, he said. The Constitution is very clear. You don't go to war without a declaration.
But my very concern is, where are all the other Republican candidates? I mean, why aren't they speaking out against the war in Libya? Is it just one of them who can see? Anybody in their right mind knows we're at war with Libya. But why doesn't the others, sort of the Sarah Palins and the Michelle Bachmans and the others, speak out against it? Because I think there are an awful lot of Americans who can see that this is the path to the next major war.
Yes, it really is. The neocons are back in strength and beating the drums of war, especially about Iran. John Bolton must talk daily on news shows about the need to attack Iran. But, I think Republicans are in this trap that they have been the defender of war ever since we got on the wrong side of the Vietnam conflict. Of course, the right side was the fact that it was a need to protect the world from communism, but that's why Vietnam was sabotaged to so burned people into people's consciousness how evil, or not evil, how costly and how windless a war against communists is. And that's why you didn't have any banners about support our troops being put out by the government during the Vietnam era. But all of a sudden, when wars have a globalist purpose, now you have all this powerful propaganda, this knee-jerk patriotic reaction aimed at conservatives and Republicans to support our troops in any of the wars involved.
And of course they play up, the Congressional Medal of Honor given to this brave fellow. And he is a brave fellow. I'm not detracting from what he did. There are a lot of brave fellows over there. It's all simply to get us behind the war over there in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's all showbiz, ladies and gentlemen. Those boys are being asked to go over and give their lives for absolutely nothing. We're not fighting terrorism. We're financing it throughout the world. Where do you think the money comes from? Well, for the terrorists, well, it comes from Pakistani intelligence, ISI. Where do they get their money? American tax dollars at work. American tax dollars at work. Well, Joel, you've got 3 minutes to wrap up the program.
Well, there were two bills defeated in Congress this week purporting to limit the war in Libya. That wasn't their true purpose at all, which demonstrates why conservatives have to be careful about the deception of appearances. Congressman Ron Paul explains why. He says, Mr. Speaker, I rise to oppose this legislation which masquerades as the limitation of funds for the President's war on Libya, but is in fact an authorization for that very war. According to H.R. 2278, the U.S. military cannot be involved in NATO's action in Libya, with 4 important exceptions. If this passes, for the first time, the President would be authorized to use U.S. armed forces to engage in search and rescue, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, aerial refueling, and operational planning against Libya. Currently, absent an authorization or declaration of war, these activities are illegal. So instead of ending the war against Libya, this bill would legalize the war on nearly everything the President is currently doing there. Well, that the war in Libya can be ended by expanding it is just a charade, and it's really a problem that we have so much deception now in the Congress with Republican leadership there that, in fact, we get nothing done. There's only been 15 bills passed in this entire congressional series, and most of those have been appointments to various agencies. There hasn't been a major bill passed of any piece of legislation. That's how ineffective this Congress is, as split as it is.
A tragic commentary on the House of Representatives. Of course, there's no leadership there. So John Boehner is simply playing his part. It's all political theater. They get up, they give their speeches, they pound on the podium, and they are there not to accomplish anything, but to give the impression that we have representative government. We have the finest politicians that money could buy.
Yes, and I don't see any change in the Republican candidates. If Ron Paul is increasingly being isolated in the polls, they never talk about him, and I think they're going to cull him out from the debates by thinning down the field. I think that's their purpose. Michelle Bachmann is being touted as the Tea Party candidate. I don't think she's got the strength to resist the establishment advisors that will surround her. I think she's got good basic gut conservative feelings, but I just don't think she's going to be strong enough to do anything.
And apparently, at least according to David Kidd, she's been taking an awful lot of money from some of the people in the big banks and financial interests. So we're going to be covering some of that next week. Well, our guest, of course, has been Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief. And Joel, we'll look forward to, I guess we won't be talking to you tomorrow morning. You got the morning off.
Oh, thank you very much, Stan.
Bye-bye. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and we hope you enjoy our programs with Joel Skousen. He is keeping you abreast of what's really going on, the information you're not going to get from the controlled media. You have to understand, ladies and gentlemen, 6 major corporations control 90% of the major media, and that, of course, is the AOL Time Warner. They've split up, but they're still interconnected through interlocking boards of directors, Bertelsmann, a German corporation, Viacom, Disney, Sydney Fox, and then GE and Comcast. They control 90 to 95% of the major media in America and make mockery of this whole idea of a free press. It's about time you understood. This is why I do what I do 5 hours a day, to try to educate the people. And of course, we've got some people out there who are doing an excellent job. But remember, of course, the other side has infiltrated the conservative movement, the talk show movement, and is putting out a lot of false information, a lot with good information. I hope you know who you can trust and who you can't trust. And fortunately, we have a few people on the Genesis network who are doing a great job, and some of the people on the other networks. But we're involved in a spiritual battle being fought on a political, ideological, and cultural battlefield. You need to get my book, Brotherhood of Darkness, my talk on the dark secret, my talk on the forbidden secret, and of course my talk on the secret. We hope that you'll get the information, that you'll disseminate it, and of course that you'll go to our website at radioliberty.com, where you can watch our DVDs. You can watch a section on other DVDs on the web. You can listen to our radio programs 9 hours a day, 24 hours a day if you have unlimited telephone access. And, of course, you can read our newsletters. You can read many of the articles up there. You can spend a lot of time on our website gaining the information which will allow you to begin to understand the spiritual battle that's being fought behind the scenes. We do carry Joel's books. You'll certainly want to get those. You'll want to get Dr. Cuddy's 4 CD sets on the Illuminati, Barry Shavish's CD set on Sydney, on the Return of the Giants. You want to get Lynn Marzulli's Watchers 1, Watchers 2, Pastor Billy Crow's information on the Final Countdown, a 10-part DVD series. His 8-part DVD series on the Fearful Creation, his 10-part DVD series on the Judge Creation, and where he'd be with us and as we go through that step by step. You need to understand we're involved in a spiritual battle for the souls of men and the survival of Christian civilization. They've infiltrated the Christian churches here. They've infiltrated our seminaries. They've changed, in large part, both the message and the music of the church. Have you noticed how the music has changed? Do you understand the impact of rock and roll? You need to get the DVD. They sold their souls for rock and roll. They sold their souls for rock and roll. And, of course, it's the 3-hour, the 4-hour, the 10-hour version put together by Pastor Joe Schimmel, who is actually into the rock music until he realized that he was demonically possessed, and he's done a wonderful job. We have a number of things that Joe Schimmel's put out, but we certainly recommend. They sold their souls for rock and roll. And you need to understand, ladies and gentlemen, that we are under attack from every point of view. They've undermined the morals of our country, and there's no nation that's ever turned against God where God has not eventually brought his judgment on that nation. So please pray for America. Pray for revival, that people turn back to God, get back to studying the Scriptures, and then we ask you to pray for our leaders, our ministers, but pray for Radio Liberty, for our provision and for our protection. And so until tomorrow at the same time, we'll be with you once again. This is Dr. Stan saying goodbye, and may the Lord be with you.